Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. We are talking about Matthew chapter 13 in 5 minutes. If you want the handout that you're about to see on the screen, there's a link down in the description where you can download the outline. When did the events of chapter 13 take place? Well, this would have been during Jesus' ministry, probably between 26 and 31 AD. We only have a few main characters in this chapter. Jesus, who's going to be teaching a lot in parables. Then we have Jesus' disciples, who are going to be listening a lot to his parables. And then finally, the citizens of the city of Nazareth. These were Jesus' hometown folks, the people who he had grown up around. And they are going to reject Jesus and his preaching when he comes to town. Where do the events of chapter 13 take place? Well, most of what happens in this chapter occur near the Sea of Galilee. Jesus was teaching the crowds in parables from a boat that was in the sea. And after teaching, he later goes to Nazareth, his hometown, as we just mentioned. Now let's discuss an outline of the major sections of this chapter. The first section, the parable of the seed and the sower. This is verses 1 through 23. While at the Sea of Galilee, Jesus taught the people using a parable about a farmer who spread seed, and that seed fell on 4 different types of soil. Some of the seed grew really well, while other types didn't. And Jesus' disciples came to him and they asked him why he taught in parables. Why not just give the plain interpretation? Jesus responded, "To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given." Jesus then went on to interpret the parable. He said that the seed represents the word of God, God's message, the gospel. And the different soils represented the condition of the hearts of those who heard God's words and their willingness to be obedient to them. We get another parable in verses 24 through 30. This is the parable of the wheat and the weeds. So a farmer went out and he sowed good seed to produce a good crop in his field. But that night, or later on, while he was sleeping, his enemies came and they sowed weeds in his field. When a servant came to the farmer and asked what should be done, the farmer said that the weeds and the good wheat could grow up together and they would be separated at the harvest. At the harvest, the wheat was brought into the barns and the weeds were burned. Next up, we've got 2 pretty short parables. In verses 31 through 32, the parable of the mustard seed. In verses 33 through 35, the parable of the leaven. And then in verses 36 through 43, Jesus gives an explanation of the parable that he's already told, the parable of the wheat and the weeds. Jesus' disciples wanted an explanation of the parable of the wheat and the weeds, just like Jesus had given them for the parable of the sower. So let me read to you what Jesus said in regards to this parable. So the man who sowed the good seed, this farmer, he represents the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed is the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. So at the end of time, the judgment day, the wicked, who are represented by the weeds, they're going to be burned up, they're going to be destroyed and punished. Whereas the righteous, who are represented by the good crop, they're going to be gathered into God. Now we're not done with parables yet. In verse 44, we have the parable of the treasure. Verse 45 through 46, the parable of the valuable pearl. Verse 47 through 57, the parable of the fishing net. And then we're done with parables. At that point, Jesus has told them all. Jesus goes to Nazareth, his hometown, to preach to the people there. Jesus headed to Nazareth, which is west of the Sea of Galilee, and he taught the people in the synagogue. And the people of his hometown were impressed by his teaching, but they doubted that he could be the long-awaited Messiah. Okay, so let's talk about the big picture. I think one thing that's true in this chapter, that's true really throughout the entire Bible, and even in the modern day, is that God does not always spoon-feed us the truths that he wants us to understand. He has always had an expectation that men will diligently seek him and discover his will for their lives. And that expectation is on display here in Matthew chapter 13. Jesus didn't give explanations for all of the parables that he told. He expected his listeners to hear, to meditate on what they heard, and then to come to a conclusion about what that meant and how that was to be applied in their life. And that kind of ties into our application. In light of the way that Jesus taught, consider how we teach in our church buildings and in modern 21st century churches. Perhaps we are expecting too little from our audiences.